Today's story is called David and Goliath. Now, David was a little shepherd boy. That meant that he did a job out in the fields where he looked after the sheep all day long. Now, David didn't know this, but one day he was going to be the new king. And this is how it happened. The king at the time was King Saul, and King Saul and his army were fighting the Philistines. Now, every day they would go out and they would see the Philistines coming towards them. The Philistines would send their biggest and strongest soldier to fight them. This soldier was called Goliath, and he was a giant compared to all of Saul's soldiers. So every day the Philistines would send Goliath across the hill, and he would call out, "Who is going to fight me?" Now, all of Saul's army were very scared of Goliath, and the minute that they saw him, they ran away. They didn't want to fight him. They knew that he was big and strong, and they could not win. And this kept happening. It kept going on every single day. Now, a lot of David's brothers, so this is David, a lot of his brothers were in Saul's army, in King Saul's army. And one day, David's father gave David some food for David to take to his brothers who were out on the army field, on the battlefield. And so David made his way all the way to the battlefield, and he brought his brothers the food. Now, this day was the same as any other day. The Philistines had sent Goliath over the hill, and they had said, "Who is going to fight him?" All of the soldiers looked very scared and wanted to run away. All except David. Now, David wasn't a soldier. Remember, David was just a shepherd boy. He used to stay in the fields and look after the sheep all day long. But David was a man who loved God very much. He was really, really close to God. He would talk to God and he would ask for God's help always. And you know, sometimes David would ask God to help him to look after the sheep, because the sheep might get attacked by wolves and other animals in the wild. And so David knew that he had a God who loved him very much and who he loved very much. And David trusted God and God's superpower to always help him. And so David said, "I will fight the giant." Oh my goodness, this was not going to be easy for David to do this. But none of the other soldiers wanted to do it. And Saul, King Saul, knew he needed somebody to do something to make the nasty giant Goliath go away. And so this is what happened. They got David and they said, "If you're going to go to battle, David, you must wear all of the armour." So they got some armour for David to wear. But as you can see, David was quite little. So this armour was all a bit too big for David. And he could hardly stand up with it on. And do you know what? It kept on falling off of him. And in the end, David felt like it was so difficult to move. He'd got his shield and his sword, all of his things ready to go and fight the big giant Goliath. But do you know what? David couldn't move. He couldn't move with all that armour on. It was so heavy. So David said, "No, let's take it off I don't need the armour. I don't want the armour. I trust my God with his power to help me. And so this is what happened. David went down to a little stream, and there he found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stones. And David used to use stones sometimes to help him to fight the animals that were attacking his sheep. And so David had an idea. He said he was going to use these stones, and he knew that with God's power, the super power that God had for him, the Holy Spirit, he would defeat the giant. And so David went out with his stones with him and his trusty sling, which helped him to throw the stones. He went out to face the giant Goliath, and he said, I am going to fight you with the power of my God, so God's Holy Spirit. Remember that superpower? I will fight you. And you know what Goliath did? He laughed. He laughed and he laughed and he laughed. He thought how silly a little boy thought that he could fight a big, tough giant like him. But just as the giant was laughing, David took a stone and he put it in his sling and he twisted it around and around and around and around until it was twisting so fast that the stone flung out of the sling and it hit the giant straight on his head. And you know what happened? The giant fell all the way to the ground. Oh my goodness, little David, the little shepherd boy who looked after the sheep, had used the stones and God's superpower to defeat the giant. My goodness, Saul and his army were absolutely amazed. Little David had done the thing that they thought was impossible. God had looked after them. God had kept his promises. And it all turned out fine. The big giant was no longer there asking to have a fight every single day. And you know, there's a Bible verse in the Bible that I always like to remember when I think about this story, and it's in the book of Philippians, and it's chapter 4 verse 13, and it says, I can do all things through God who gives me strength. So I wonder whether there's something that you want to do today, something that you think might be a bit big and scary, a bit like facing the big, big giant. And I wonder whether God's superpower might be able to help you.